All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here, we do our preview and prediction for the long-awaited college football semifinal game in Atlanta, the Peach Bowl between Ohio State and Georgia. 7-point favorites are the Dogs. Over/under set at 61.5. New Year's Eve will be the date of this contest. ESPN 8 p.m. Eastern Time. UJ leads the all-time series 1-0, winning in 1993. Looking at Ohio State. Nick, they sat at home during conference championship weekend due to, rather poor performance, I guess you could say, against Michigan. But top to bottom this year, offense has been quite stellar. 44.5 points per game, 493 yards per contest. C.J. Stroud, 3,340 yards, 37 touchdowns, 6 picks. Likely going to get an invite to New York. I think this is big for Ohio State. You look at the Michigan game for one, though. I think they had a really good first half in that one. In the second half, Michigan was starting to get some better penetration on the interior. They're breaking on passing windows a lot better. One thing for Ohio State, though, I think we got to monitor is the health of this football team. The backfield was incredibly beat up. They had Steele Chambers, who's been, they had Chip Trainum playing running back, who's been at linebacker all year, has played running back for the majority of his career, but they were still that beat up. Travion Henderson, Mayan Williams gives this a big opportunity to get healthy, having, 30-plus days of rest. Jackson Smith-Njigba as well has only played, for 2 games this year. He's really been battling a hamstring injury. We're going to see what the development is on him. And that'd be a big return for this football team. Perfect timing as well, because Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka have had phenomenal seasons already. They both have 1,000 yards combined for 21 touchdowns. I think this Ohio State offense, with these talented pass catchers and this Heisman finalist quarterback, along with being pretty deep at running back, this is a heck of a matchup. I'm very excited to see this one go down. Was Ohio State that deserving of the playoff? Maybe not, losing by 20 to Michigan due to a bad fourth quarter. But I think this is a very exciting matchup due to what Ohio State possesses, Nick.
I like this Ohio State offense. There's a lot of talent here. Of course, C.J. Stroud, one of the better quarterbacks in college football. Solid season for him, top to bottom, 3,302% completion percentage, 37 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. For me, it's about how much of this next couple, month and change, can this team get around and get healthy. These guys have a lot of injury concerns. Can they kind of rehab and get to full health? Williams and Travion Henderson, these two running backs together, they perform a solid duo, right? Maya Williams, 817 yards on the season, 13 touchdowns. Travion Henderson, 571 yards on the season, 6 scores for him. When you have to have a running back converted back to running back, playing this weekend, past weekend against Michigan, certainly is not what you want to see if you're Ohio State. You want to be fully healthy if you're going to be going against a Georgia defense that is absolutely stellar so far this season. So Ohio State offense, though, is not bad, right? The numbers are good. 44.5 points per game, 492 total yards of offense per game. They just looked a little lethargic and slow against Michigan. They got, and in the second half especially, right? This team had a good first half on offense against Michigan. Then they kind of just fell off the pace a little bit, and Michigan kind of pulled away there late and was able to get the big win for them that cemented their spot in the playoff. Michigan slots in at number 2. We'll be playing TCU. We'll discuss them in another episode. Marvin Harrison Jr., incredible season, just like his father in the past. 1,100 yards receiving, 12 touchdowns for him. Egbuka as well. He's having a solid season, 1,000 yards receiving, 9 touchdowns for him. And that's the part that's crazy, is that their best offensive weapon has not played as much. JSN is just not playing. He's not healthy, battling that hamstring injury. If he's fully healthy come playoffs, that guy adds a total another dynamic for this Georgia defense to keep on. We saw that Keely Ringo did not have a great weekend against this past weekend. JSN's the type of guy you have to cover him. You got to make sure he's marked at all times because he's such an incredible weapon and difference maker.
Julian Fleming as well, 462 yards on 29 grabs. And Cade Stover, I think he's having a pretty underrated season as a blocker and a pass catcher. Has really, lifted his draft stock this year. This is a rushing attack that averages 5.5 yards per carry. And this offensive line, Nick, another reason why I think this is a very interesting matchup for Georgia is, we'll talk about their defense here shortly, but this is not really a team that possesses great pass rushing threats from the edge, and now they have to face 2 bookend tackles in Paris Johnson and DeJuan Jones. Only 1 sack allowed between the two and 700-plus snaps each. And then Luke Weipler at center, I think he's had a phenomenal year as well, especially against the pass. Matthew Jones, I think he's more of a weaker link up front. He hasn't had a bad season himself, only 0 sacks, but I definitely think he's a guy that's going to have to perform very well against Jalen Carter and is likely to draw that matchup as well. Top to bottom, this is the exact type of, organization, I guess you could say, to beat a Georgia defense. And I think this offense certainly possesses it, top to bottom. What are going to be expectations for this game? Because the last time we seen them in that second half against Michigan, only 3 points. Stroud ended up with 2 picks. And there's, of course, some pressure being given up. So what do you expect here? What do you think Ryan Day is going to change to, be better suited to play against a very good Georgia defense?
I certainly do like the potential this offensive line has against this defensive line for Georgia. Like you said, they really do struggle to get around the edge when you have guys like Jones and Johnson on the left and right tackle that add some serious potential here. Donovan Jackson as well, redshirt freshman. I get a little concerned about seeing him at left tackle. I think he is, sort of a potential weak spot. They can kind of get after him, especially, and Matthew Jones as well on the opposite side. I think the 2 guards, add potential for Georgia to kind of get in there and make Stroud uncomfortable. This offense just did not have life in the second half, right? Like you said, 3 points is just not good enough. They were well behind the pace at that point. I think if JSN plays, that's a total wild card for this team. I think he's going to add a lot of potential for this team to kind of attack through the air and create some new momentum. They got to have their backs healthy, and if they need to find that balance early on, find the balance of Williams and Henderson, be able to run the ball when they can, and then hit Harrison or Fleming when they need to, who can be open on different sides of the field. I think this offense has serious potential to put up points against Georgia, but also this Georgia defense has smothered a lot of teams so far this season. We did see that happen in the past.
Talking about the Georgia offense, remember the committee a couple weeks ago, they said they loved Ohio State's explosive nature, and I'm like, well, they didn't say anything about Georgia's offense, and they put up pretty much the same numbers, and they're just as good. They're just a little bit quieter because they do it mainly with balance. 39 points per game, 492 yards per contest of their own. Stetson Bennett having a pretty good season, 3,400 yards, 27 touchdowns, only 6 picks. He's come a long way. He's developed very well from where he started a couple years ago. And, now he's probably going to be on his way to New York. A lot of people are saying he'll be a Heisman finalist. I think this is a good offense for him to run. He's well above being a game manager, I think, at this point in his career, but this system really suits him. Todd Monken, great play calling, starts with a physical offensive line, though. Broderick Jones probably going to be a first rounder. Tate Rutledge at guard has been really good. Warren Erickson, he's had a pretty respectable season himself. And Cedric Van Pran, whoever gets the start at center, they've both had a good year. I mean, they really coach up the offensive line here, Nick. These guys play with plenty of physicality. I think they certainly lead the FBS when it comes to that category. I think their running back by committee approach is one thing that's really underrated about Georgia. They have 4 different backs they can give the ball to. 3 of them have 500-plus yards on the year. 10.5 attempts per game by Kenny McIntosh is the lead. That's not very many touches. They dish this ball around plenty. That's why they don't have a big 1,000-yard back, even though McIntosh is 709 yards and 10 touchdowns, creeping in on that. They do such a good job of rotating these guys. They're able to stay healthy. I absolutely love this backfield. Dejon Edwards, he's had a bit of a fumble problem himself. Branson Robinson, he's a big bruiser himself, but he's a freshman. And Kendall Milton, of course. Kenny McIntosh, though, he also gets involved as a pass catcher. 37 grabs, 449 yards. He doesn't exactly possess what James Cook did last year for them, but it's still a guy that you have to account for. And then you look at the other weapons; they're not incredibly deep in terms of talent at pass catcher. Ladd McConkey, a former, I think he was a former 3-star. We only had a handful of offers coming out of school. 51 receptions, 675 yards. The last couple of weeks has certainly not made many mistakes like he did early on in the year. So that's important to note. Brock Bowers, of course, probably the greatest tight end I've seen as a talent. 52 grabs, 726, hurts you up the seam. He's a great blocker. You run after catch. The way he moves for being 6'4", 230 is absolutely absurd. Darnell Washington, a big body guy, has gotten involved a good bit this year. 6'7", 270. They love to dump it off to him in the flat. He's a nightmare to try and tackle. Marcus Rosemy-Jackson as well. They're not incredibly loaded with talent or size, I'd say, out wide at wide receiver. They have guys like Dominic Blaylock, Kyrus Jackson to dish it out to. 9 different guys have double-figure receptions on this offense. But it doesn't matter. Georgia's really been able to utilize a physical run game and a quarterback who's a veteran at this point that does not make too many mistakes. And I think Georgia offense, this is one of the more underrated units in all of college football this year.
It is fair to say this offense is underrated. It doesn't have a whole lot of talent, but they have the balance to make it work. 39.2 points per game, 491.9 yards per contest. This is a solid offense top to bottom. When you look at the receiving core, yes, there's not a whole lot of talent that jumps off the paper here, but Brock Bowers, generational talent, ridiculous, best tight end I've ever seen play. You got a guy like Darnell Washington, who is a great tight end, more of your prototypical tight end, getting a lot of love in the NFL draft. A lot of scouts are having him at a round 1 grade. I see him in a couple mock drafts early on, late first round. I like Darnell Washington's size, having a good season too. 417 yards, 16 yards per catch plus the 2 scores for him. Ladd McConkey, he continues to come into his own every single week. He seems to get better and better after having a slow start to the season with some drops. 675 yards for him. 13.2 yards per catch plus the 5 scores for him. McIntosh, good receiving back, good running back as well on the ground. They split it up a lot. We noted that earlier in this segment. They do split it up a lot, but McIntosh leads the way at 709 yards on the ground, plus the 10 scores for him. I like the split they have here of McIntosh, Edwards, and Milton. These 3 backs all together, especially Robinson as well at the 4th. These are 4 backs that are all very talented, that can carry the ball for you. They split the attempts, through them pretty evenly between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. I think there's a solid balance there. They have 4 backs they can rely on any segment of the game and pick up ground as well. Stetson Bennett, improving as a quarterback as the season has gone on, kind of shaking those game manager comments, a little bit. He is having a good season. He's been dynamic at times when he needs to be. Almost 3,500 yards, 68.1% completion percentage, 20 touchdowns plus the 6 interceptions. And like you said, should be getting a call to New York for the Heisman ceremony. This offense doesn't jump out off the stat sheet for you. They're a team you have to watch them over and over again to kind of see where they are. If you watch a lot of Georgia this year, you can see how dynamic this offense is if you look at the X's and O's. This is a good offense that has potential to put up a lot of points in the playoff.
Not looking at the Ohio State defense, is going to look to contain them. I picked the Buckeyes to lose to Michigan because I thought this defense would be soft, just like it was last year. I feel like, kind of much like 2021, throughout the year they looked good, but when they played the tougher opponents, they got absolutely hammered. And that's kind of what happened against Michigan, but not fully. They had 2 runs late by Donovan Edwards that accounted for 160 rushing yards. Before that, only 92 on 33 attempts. They controlled the line of scrimmage very, very well. And it's a very similar style of offense comparing Georgia to Michigan. And Georgia's going to, of course, have a little bit more physicality. But I think they match up, not too bad. I think Ohio State, I could be wrong on that, but Jerron Cage, Tyleik Williams, these guys on the defensive line have certainly been good at getting penetration. Zach Harrison's been an impressive edge rusher. He's still inconsistent, but I think for the most part, he's had a heck of a season. Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimolotu, they have gotten a lot more involved this year. I think this is a very talented defensive front. They certainly don't get enough recognition, I would say. And, how they played against Michigan, I think is very underrated. Tuimolotu, 11 TFLs for him. Tommy Eichenberg, though, I think this is a guy that's really emerged, got snubbed for the Butkus Award, 112 tackles, 12 tackle for loss. He was not very good a season ago. He's one of the top run defenders in all of college football this year. Very happy to see his resurgence. And they look at another guy on the defensive line, to Michael Hall, who's also been a heck of a run stopper as well. Not, eye-popping production, only 19 tackles, 7.5 for loss, but he's a guy that really is a force on the middle for them. And then Cody Simon, I think he's also been a pretty impressive run blocker. We'll focus on the secondary here in a second, Nick, that certainly has its, fair share of weaknesses. But how do you think this front 6/7 matches up against this Georgia offensive line? Because that's where the game's going to be decided for Ohio State.
This is a solid front 7 that's not getting a whole lot of love. Eichenberg, great season, 112 total tackles, 2.5 sacks for him, plus an interception as well. I love him as a leader on this team. That total tackle number is ridiculous when you look at how it's, the second leader in tackles on the team is Steel Chambers with 69, right? So he is getting a lot of tackles and absolutely dominating. 72 total solo tackles is a really impressive number as well. But Chambers, having a good season with 69 total tackles as well. Cody Simon as well, 32 total tackles for him. He's got 2 sacks. Tui Malolu, having a great season with 3.5 sacks for him, plus the 2 interceptions. He's a great defensive end that's not getting a whole lot of love in the greater scheme of college football. Jack Sawyer as well, another great player on the defensive line, 23 total tackles for him, 4.5 sacks. I like this matchup for this defensive line. I think they have some serious potential here to stop the run early on, especially with a guy like Eichenberg leading the way. They can kind of force Georgia into a hole where Georgia has to get a little more creative and throw the ball to Bowers or Washington. I think that's a really big recipe for success on Ohio State. Can they plug the run early on and force Georgia into throwing the ball? That might be their best chance to win against Georgia.
They like to drop JT in the coverage a handful of times, too. He forced a pick against Penn State, had 2 interceptions, including housing one himself. That's a versatile edge playmaker. They're going to look to drop into those passing windows, try to catch Bennett off guard. And, this is a good front 6/7 that I think can really perform well in this game. You look at the safety duo of Lathan Ransom and Ronnie Hickman, top to bottom this year. They've had a phenomenal year, but they were not good one bit against Michigan. Nobody in the secondary was. This is a unit that, it was the complete opposite of what we thought would happen. At least for me, I thought they would get dominated on the ground. They got dominated through the air, giving up numerous big passing plays, but they were just flat out getting beat at the top of their routes by these receivers. They got to be a lot better in this one, Nick. Obviously, I think Michigan's pass catchers probably a little better than Georgia's from a pure talent standpoint. But, getting beat by Cornelius Johnson on, a handful of big plays wasn't great, including not being able to tackle on the edge. That was the reason for one of them. This is a secondary that's also got guys like Tanner McAllister. Jim Knowles brought him over from Oklahoma State, having a pretty respectable year. 10 interceptions on the year for the secondary. They look good on the stat sheet, but of course they've not faced many good passing attacks one bit this year, and Michigan might be the best one they faced, and they failed the task tremendously. And again, it's a similar style of offense. So I think Georgia, they're going to look to attack these guys downfield. I think, in the intermediate range, one thing Georgia does very well is they convert like 55% of their third downs. They're just exceptional at doing that. And the big reason why is because they're able to get Bennett comfortable and he's able to deliver strikes. It's very effortless, it seems, when Georgia's on third down, and that's where Ohio State's going to have to thrive in the secondary. They also gave up 371 to Penn State, another passing attack. It's got some quite solid talent, but now you have to account for this physical running game by Georgia. I feel like this might be a bad day for Ohio State's secondary.
I agree. It's possible the secondary gets exposed against this Georgia team. I like Ransom and Hickman. Both these guys are having solid seasons. Like a guy like McAllister. He has 3 interceptions on the season so far. One of the leaders on this defense in terms of picks, for they have 10 total picks. He leads the way of the 3. I think the secondary is not bad necessarily. I just think that they have gotten picked apart against the good offenses they have played passing. Michigan picked them apart when they needed to. They found the holes in the secondary and the coverage, and they were able to hit their stride, pick up huge ground games, right? Hickman is a good player, but he's looked a little lost at times so far this season, as well as Ransom. So I think Georgia has potential definitely to pick them apart because they have such a balance on offense with this Georgia offense that they can you can focus too heavy on the run, then your secondary gets it. They focus too heavy on the secondary and the passing, then the run game will hit you. So I think Ohio State's in a bit of a lose-lose situation on defense against Georgia because, damned if you do, damned if you don't. They could find themselves in serious trouble considering the balance that Georgia has.
A big thing that was plaguing them against Michigan, especially late in that game, is they were playing a lot of man coverage, but absolutely burned them against the run. I think you're going to see a more zone-heavy approach here, which, that might work if they can find a pass rush. I think that's certainly possible, so we'll see what happens on that front. I do expect Knowles to, operate with a lot more zone in this one. Looking at the Georgia defense, again, a pretty phenomenal year. 292 yards per game allowed by Georgia, 12.8 points per contest. This unit has been terrific top to bottom. Look at Jalen Carter, an elite mover on the interior defensive line. Doesn't have much from a production standpoint, but his general impact is all that matters. He's one of the top defensive tackles in college football. I think he's the best at his position. Guys like Nazir Stackhouse have gotten involved. It's really been by committee on this defensive front. And they've been great, though. They're still top ranked against the run. Michael Williams, true freshman, has gotten involved a good bit this season. Not having Nolan Smith out there certainly hurt them, Nick. And the one thing I talk about with this defense, I think, is a weakness, is they don't have much of a pass rush. I don't know who on this roster I can look to and identify as a star pass rusher. Carter has 3 on the year from his interior spot. Jamon Dumas Johnson has 3 sacks as well from his inside linebacking spot, and then Nolan Smith still leads the team despite not playing. He's only played 8 games this year, and he's still the leader. So this team does not really have an outside edge presence. Obviously, long term, that's not going to be a big problem. Chaz Chambliss, maybe this guy they're going to look to, a young player. Robert Beal has not stepped up much this season. And then you want to look at Dumas Johnson and Ismail Munden, 2 young inside linebackers that have played phenomenal this year. So top to bottom, the front 7 is still great. One of the weaknesses, though, that we kind of talked about with Georgia is potentially the secondary not being that great. And I was very intrigued to see them play a very talented wide receiving group by LSU. And I think they failed the test. I think that's safe to say. They give up 500 passing yards. And, you can blame course of the game if you want to and how it flowed. But they, had 52 passing attempts, and they had 500-plus yards. Mississippi State also had 52 passing attempts, trying to claw back into that one a couple weeks ago. And then we had 260 yards, 5 yards per attempt, almost 10 for LSU between 2 different quarterbacks. They're getting absolutely torn up. Keely Ringo, a lot of Georgia fans keep calling him a first-team All-American. He did not look like one against LSU. Gave up 130-plus yards in that one. Dan Jackson, he's one of their best coverage guys. He hasn't played in weeks because he's been out. Malachi Starks, a true freshman, he's had a very impressive season, but he himself at safety has had some miscommunication issues. Chris Smith, same with him, very inconsistent from coverage. They have some very talented DBs. All those guys we named can play football, and they can do it at a very high level, or they wouldn't be at Georgia. But I was very interested to see how the secondary would perform. They looked very good against Tennessee a couple weeks ago back at home, playing a lot of man coverage. They were able to stick with those pass catchers, but against LSU, Nick, completely different story, and it led to them allowing 30 points, which is far and away a season high. And now they have to turn around and face this Ohio State passing attack that's full of former 5-star recruits, potential first-rounders. How do you think they match up in this one, and what do you think they're going to do to maybe adjust for a much more talented passing attack?
I certainly know Kirby Smart's going to be having a lot of strong practices, a lot of long practices over the next few weeks, trying to get his secondary ready, considering how poor they looked against LSU. I didn't have LSU scoring 30 points, certainly, and 500 yards through the air. That is a lot for LSU to put up against Georgia. The secondary just looked lost. Keely Ringo has been inconsistent. He's looked lost at times. Malachi Starks, having a great season, but he's made mistakes, right? There have been simple times where he's made mistakes.
It's cost Georgia big time.
Doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things when your defense is as strong as they are, they're able to clean it up. But this secondary has struggled. 12.8 points allowed per game for this defense across the season. 292 total yards of offense allowed, which are great numbers on paper, but you expected better out of this Georgia team. Jalen Carter and Nazir Stackhouse, both elite on the defensive line, but
you really hoped out of them.
I know Stackhouse has fought some injuries. Jalen Carter has as well, but they have each, Carter 29 total tackles, Stackhouse 28. Stackhouse 0 sacks on the season. Carter has 3. You wanted to see bigger numbers out of these guys. These guys are supposed to be your stars, and they really have not been getting after the quarterback. Dumas Johnson has been really the only standout person in the front 7 for me, with the 3 sacks and 64 total tackles for him. But outside of his performance, this front 7 has not lived up to the hype that they thought they had. Yes, of course, stepping back from that last year, considering how much talent they lost to the draft, you'd expect the front 7 to take a step back. Yes, it is only right, but it's a pipeline of talent there in Athens. You'd expect this defense to be as strong as they were getting after the quarterback, and they really just have struggled with that this year. They're just struggling to get after the quarterback, and it's posing a problem for them. I know they lost Nolan Smith earlier in the season, which has not helped, but still, this team is full of 5 stars, next man up mentality, and these guys just have not really stepped up to the plate. The secondary has not been great, and I need to see a lot more out of them against Ohio State if I want to believe this team's going to win a national championship.
They were able to find 6 sacks against Tennessee. Not really from the edge. Javon Bullard, I believe he had like 2 or 2.5 of those coming from his slot position. They had 4 sacks against LSU, working against 2 true freshman tackles, and they still gave up 500 passing yards. So the pass rush wasn't exactly absent in that game. They still gave up those totals. Like I mentioned earlier, they're facing 2 all-conference tackles now. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I know people are thinking, and they're expecting Georgia to steamroll Ohio State in this one. I think there's some real holes here that could really favor the Buckeyes that could lead to a big, opportunity for them. Bullard, I think he top to bottom has had a pretty respectable season, especially in that Tennessee game. This is a guy in the slot who's certainly had his fair share of struggles, and I think that, if Jackson Smith-Njigba's back and he gets that spot, it's going to be the toughest matchup of his career. I'm not exactly sure he would win that, more often than not. So, top to bottom, what do you think this Georgia defense is going to do, Nick? Because I think they might have some struggles because I'm really not sure who's going to provide a presence off the edge, especially against those tackles in the secondary. I felt like it was going to get exposed at some point this year, and they did far in a way against LSU.
It is true that Bullard could get after the quarterback at times. He adds a certain dynamic to this defense. But if he's matching him against JSN, I think he'll be in serious trouble, just like you said. I think the secondary will bounce back, and this defense as a whole will bounce back against Ohio State. But it's certainly concerning if you're a Georgia fan. They're not the lights-out defense that you'd hope they were. They showed cracks against LSU. I know they won that game by 20 points, but still, giving up 30 points to LSU was a lot of points to give up. You did not expect that when you came into the game on Saturday. You did not think you'd give up that many points against that Jaden Daniels offense. I'd be a little concerned if I was a Georgia fan, just simply top to bottom. The defense has not lived up to the expectations, but I think they'll be fine against Ohio State.
Yeah, Jaden Daniels played quite well in the first half. It was the Nussmeier show in the second, and he was out there loading it up. He had quite a cannon. He was just throwing it all over the place. Look at team comparisons. I think quarterback Ohio State's going to get the edge. C.J. Stroud, Stetson Bennett, they're both going to get New York invites, but Stroud's a much more talented one. He's a much more important quarterback in this game. At running back, Georgia, they're 4 deep at that position. Ohio State, I expect them to be probably fully healthy and given 27 days off or whatever the number may be. Probably more than that, actually. Their running back core is also really good. You could potentially call that even. We'll give it to Georgia. Wide receiver, Ohio State, they're right up there with the nation's deepest pass-catching groups, especially if JSN's back. And then the rest of it's going to go to the Bulldogs, Nick. This offensive line for Ohio State, I think they're really good with the physicality Georgia brings to the table that allows them to just dominate on the ground. It's one of the nation's best. Defensive line-wise as well, Ohio State, they're not too far behind. They're not trailing by much, but the Bulldogs, led by Jalen Carter, will get the edge there, the nation's top-ranked run defense. Then the linebacking group, again, for Ohio State, Tommy Eichenberg's having a great year. That's a very well-coached position for the Bulldogs. They're having a phenomenal year in the middle of their defense. And then secondary, I'm going to call it either. I'm not incredibly thrilled with either of these secondaries. They're both coming off pretty poor efforts in their last games before this meeting. So I'm going to call it even on the secondary. Maybe Georgia can get a slight edge, but it's hard to say after the performance on Saturday. How do you feel about these team comparisons?
I would say that the offensive line is probably the one that I'm a little more iffy on than you. I think that the talent that they have at tackle for Ohio State with Johnson and Jones at left and right tackle respectively, I think those two guys they add so much talent and so much ability on the edge there that's really tough for defense to get around the edge. Georgia's not really a big edge rushing team so far this season, so I think that kind of X's and O's battle doesn't really hurt them per se as it might hurt a different team. But when you have that talent on your outside, I think that's only going to help. and the interior offensive line has improved as the season goes on at certain points. So I think Ohio State has a shout there in that matchup, but otherwise I think these team comparisons make a whole lot of sense for me. The secondaries are not wowing me at all, and I think even's a perfect fit for that.
Looking at the final thoughts and the prediction on this one, keys to the game, Ohio State. I said this against Michigan. I think they lived up to it quite well. Showcase toughness on the interior against the run. I think they have the personnel to get that done this time around. We'll see what happens. I think the linebackers must play high IQ football because Georgia, Todd Monken, they like to mix things up. And it's really basic play calling at times, but, it makes defenses look foolish. And I think you got to stress that Bulldogs secondary. You look at that Michigan game, the Wolverines were getting incredibly stressed in that first half, able to hold up, limit the damage to only 20 points. But, man, they really struggled in that early part of that game. And I think for Georgia, they got to fastly collapse the passing windows. That's something Michigan did in that second half, and it was able to open the door for, the defense to only give up 3 points in that second half because they were able to, log down on these receivers. They're not able to get that free. And I think grinding it out on the ground is going to be a big thing. I think you want to keep that offense on the sideline as much as you can. Looking at the prediction, me and Nick pretty eye to eye usually, but not on this one. I think I have the Buckeyes winning this game. I think for the big reasons I talked about, not having an edge rushing presence is probably going to doom Georgia at some point. And I think the secondary, I'm really not that thrilled with it. I don't think they've really been too good this year. Something I said a lot last year, and they ended up getting exposed against Alabama where that offensive line neutralized the defensive front of Georgia. And I think that's going to happen here. I think this offensive line, especially at tackle, I think it's going to play a very good game. I think C.J. Stroud in these pass catchers, they're pretty upset with what happened against Michigan. If Ryan Day can call a good game, I think that they'll be able to win this game. We'll see what happens, and we'll see how he can adjust when the Bulldogs do, because that could potentially plague them. But I think they're going to win this game, kind of like when they played Clemson a couple of years ago. Nobody was picking the Buckeyes, and they absolutely flamed the Tigers' defense. I think you're going to see that happen here. I think the Bulldogs' defense is going to get put on skates. I do think Georgia can certainly keep pace, though. With their offense, it's pretty good. But I think the Buckeyes will outlast them here in Atlanta. You have Georgia winning by a completely different score. You think their defense is probably going to put on a pretty good show.
Yeah, I expect the Georgia defense to step up and have a huge day. This is practically a home game for Georgia. Those fans are going to be traveling to Atlanta. It's going to be loud in there, especially when Georgia's on defense. They're going to be, the loud. They're going to be coming after it. I think Ohio State has a chance to win this game. I think of the matchups, I think they have a great chance here, considering what you listed. The offensive line is fantastic for Ohio State. That's the main key for me. Can the offensive line hold up and create those running holes? If they're able to have a running pulse of some sort and then attack the secondary when necessary, I think they can easily beat Georgia. But right now, I'm going to go with Georgia. I think they just have a better talent team on paper, top to bottom. I think that they're going to be able to figure a way to get their secondary in lock on this matchup and focus this game and kind of push out this result that they need. I expect Georgia to win this game, but it's completely possible that Ohio State comes around and attacks the secondary and dominates, just like you said.
Georgia is a very well-coached secondary. Despite a handful of bad showings from time to time, they are very well-coached. That's one thing we can all certainly admit. And C.J. Stroud is one of the most resilient quarterbacks I've seen in recent memory, so I definitely think, despite having to pretty much go on the road for this one, I think they'll be just fine. This can be a fun game. Very excited for this matchup. Ohio State against Georgia. It never happens again, only once ever in the history of football. So this is going to be a fun one, Nick. I appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, I think this will be an interesting matchup for the playoff semifinals. I like this matchup. We wanted to see this. This was kind of a fun game. Like you said, a rare matchup for these two schools. Only played once in 1993. I like this balance top to bottom in this matchup. I just think Georgia has better coaching and a better depth overall, so they're going to get the nod for me, but anything can happen on any given Saturday.
That's me for today's episode, guys. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.